Snow drifted down in heavy sheets, mingling with a cold rain that slicked the wood of the frontier town until the planks glistened like darkened glass. Lanterns swung on their iron hooks, their dim fires struggling against the storm, and shadows rippled across shuttered windows as though the town itself wished to turn its face away. Into this bleakness came a woman, her shawl soaked through, her boots heavy with slush, her white hair gleaming faintly beneath the lamplight like frost caught in the strands. Aurora Whitlock moved as though every step cost her, but she pressed forward with the quiet determination of someone who had learned long ago that survival rarely waited for kindness. The street was near empty. Only a few men hunched beneath broad hats shuffled from saloon to boarding house, their eyes sliding over her without pause, as if she were less a person than a rumor drifting past. Whispers followed in her wake nonetheless. The white-haired widow. Too old to be wanted, too poor to be useful, a reminder of grief in a town that preferred to bury its own. Aurora heard them without lifting her gaze, as if shame itself had trained her to keep her eyes fixed on the ground. She made her way to the inn, where warmth and gossip clung together like smoke. The door creaked wide, and the smell of damp coats, sour ale, and frying meat struck her. Conversations dipped, just a breath, enough to let her know her arrival had not gone unseen. Miriam Harker, the innkeeper with a voice sharp as a winter blade, leaned across the counter, her eyes narrowing. "Back again, Miss Whitlock? Thought you'd moved on like the rest of your kind." The words carried not cruelty alone, but the relish of judgment. Aurora tugged her shawl tighter. Her voice, when it came, was small but steady. "I don't talk much, sir, but I can cook." She spoke not to Miriam, but to a man near the hearth, a cattle drover nursing his drink, perhaps hoping against hope that work might appear where it rarely did. But the man only laughed, a dry sound, and turned his shoulder. Miriam's smile thinned. "Cookin' ain't the same as being welcome." Around them, chairs scraped. Boots thudded against the floorboards. No one spoke in her defense. It was as if her very presence drained light, leaving only silence and discomfort behind. Aurora lowered her gaze again, her face burning though the storm had left her skin already raw. She had known rejection, but each time it pressed against her chest as if new. Sheriff Amos Greeley sat in the corner, watching with eyes lined by too many sleepless nights. He did not rise, did not intervene, only studied her with the weariness of a man who knew the cost of taking sides. Aurora understood. She asked for no rescue. The law could not change what hearts had decided. With a quiet nod, she turned from the inn. The storm swallowed her again. Outside, the snow mixed with rain, sliding cold against her scalp. She walked without direction, the wooden buildings looming like silent judges, their windows glowing faintly from fires she would never be invited to share. Her hands ached from cold, her breath rose like smoke, and for a moment she wondered whether the storm might carry her off, erase her from a world that had long since dismissed her. But something pricked at the edges of her senses, a presence more solid than wind, more watchful than shadow. She slowed. A figure stood at the far end of the street, motionless against the white veil of snow. Shirtless, though the storm lashed mercilessly, his skin bronzed and marked with faint scars that caught the lantern light. Broad shoulders rose and fell with even breath, dark hair clung damp to his temples, and his gaze fixed on her as though the storm were nothing. Dakota! She did not yet know his name, but she knew the weight of being regarded. Not with mockery, not with pity, but with a stillness that unsettled. She clutched her shawl tighter and hurried on, though she felt the strength of his eyes linger. The night stretched long. She found a corner near a shuttered stable, where she pressed herself into the wood for shelter. The boards smelled of damp hay and old horses, and the ground was hard, yet she closed her eyes against it all. Memories rose unbidden. Her husband lowered into the earth, the small graves beside him, her hair turning white before her time as if grief itself had stolen her youth. Town after town, whisper after whisper, until she no longer dared hope. Her hands curled into fists. Still she breathed. When she woke, pale dawn was pushing against the storm. Her body shivered with cold, but she felt it again, that sense of not being alone. Across the street, half veiled by falling snow, he stood once more. The giant Apache, bare chest gleaming with frost, unbothered by cold, unblinking in his watch. He did not move toward her, did not speak. Simply stood, as though the storm itself had set him there to guard her. Her heart stumbled. She could not say why his silence unnerved her more than scorn. Perhaps because scorn she understood, but this wordless regard, offered something dangerous. The suggestion she was still visible, still worth the space she took. She rose unsteadily, brushing snow from her shawl, and forced herself to walk. Her boots left shallow prints in the drift, the sound of each step a fragile defiance against the storm. She did not look back, though she felt his presence as surely as breath. By the time she reached the road leading out of town, the snow had thickened, swallowing ruts and fences, turning the world to a white haze. Aurora paused, staring into the endless stretch ahead. She had nowhere left to go, no place that had ever held her long. She pressed her palms together, willing warmth into them, and thought perhaps this was her lot, to wander until the cold itself claimed her. Yet even in that bleak thought she felt it, the weight of eyes still upon her. Not the eyes of judgment that whispered she was cursed, not the eyes that laughed at her silence, but the eyes of one who chose to remain. And though she did not dare turn, her heart beat with the wild knowledge that in the midst of her rejection, someone had stayed behind. Someone whose silence spoke louder than all the words flung at her in scorn. Aurora walked on, snow clinging to her lashes, shawl heavy against her shoulders. Behind her, in the storm's veil, the figure had not moved. And in that stillness lay the promise of something she could not yet name, but which she knew would alter everything she thought she deserved. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was less living than enduring. Aurora found work in the dim backroom of a boarding kitchen near the edge of town, where miners came coated in coal dust and temper, slapping coins down for meals they barely tasted. Her hands moved steadily over knives and kettles, steam rising around her, the clatter of tin plates filling her ears. The pay was small, the hours long, but the work gave her breath to another day. She spoke little, head bent to her tasks, and the men, sensing her silence as weakness, sometimes laughed at her white hair as though it were an offense. She absorbed it as she always had, carrying shame as though it were stitched into her shawl. But she was not unseen. From the corner of the room, at a table where no other dared sit, he appeared. Dakota, the giant Apache. Each evening, he entered with steps so soundless the room seemed to hold its breath. His bare chest glistened with the damp of storm or snow, muscles carved as though the earth itself had shaped him. He said nothing, only took his seat and ate what she placed before him. The scrape of spoon on tin the only sound he offered. The miners muttered, casting wary looks, but none dared confront him. His stillness was heavier than their bluster. At first Aurora felt unease coil in her chest. Why did he come? Why did he watch? She did not ask. She had learned that questions could open wounds best left closed. Yet when she ladled stew into his bowl, and his eyes lifted briefly to hers, she felt something shift. There was no pity in his gaze, no mockery, only a steadiness that made her want to look away and yet linger. She turned back to her work, but her heart beat with a strange insistence. Small acts began to appear in her days, quiet as his presence. One dawn she opened the door of her lean-to cabin and found a neat stack of firewood, dry despite the storm. Another morning the loose hinge of her shutter, which had grown for weeks, swung smooth and silent. She had not seen him do these things, yet she knew. The rough precision bore his mark. She whispered no thanks, for words seemed fragile against such offerings, but when she stirred the morning's fire, her eyes softened, her shoulders less bowed. The town noticed. Whispers grew sharper. Silas Boone, a man whose bitterness spread like rot, leaned against the hitching post one afternoon, his voice pitched to Carrie. The ghost-haired widow's got herself a savage watching her. Guess old age makes a woman desperate. His companions laughed, the sound grating as shovel on rock. Aurora passed with lowered eyes, cheeks burning, but her steps did not falter. Inside, shame coiled, yet beneath it flickered something more dangerous, defiance. At market, Miriam Harker muttered loud enough for others to hear. Men vanish near him, and still she lets him linger. Either cursed or fool enough to believe a savage will keep her warm. The women tittered behind their bonnets, eyes quick with judgment. Aurora's fingers tightened on the loaf she carried, but she did not respond. Silence had become her armor. Yet later that evening, when Dakota carried a heavy water bucket from the well to her door, she did not hide her eyes. They met his, just for a breath, and though neither spoke, something unspoken rooted deeper between them. Children, less bound by scorn, sometimes lingered near him at dusk, daring each other to step close. He never moved, never threatened, only watched them with the same calm he gave the storm. They would run laughing, but Aurora, watching from her doorway, felt the quiet truth. His stillness was not absence but choice. He was not unseen, he chose to see. Nights grew harsher. Wind rattled the cabins, snow sealed doors shut, and hunger made tempers raw. The miners mocked her food, some tossing coins short of their due, others sneering when she corrected them. Aurora bore it with quiet resolve, though inside she sometimes trembled. But always in the corner, Dakota sat, eating steadily. When his bowl emptied, he left a coin, more than she asked, always exact, as if to remind her of her worth. One night, after the men left rowdy and drunk, she lingered in the kitchen, washing plates in water gone cold. She turned to find him standing there, silent. The lamplight caught the ridges of his shoulders, the scars traced along his arm. She froze, unsure of what he sought. He did not move closer, only set a bundle of kindling by the hearth and nodded once before stepping back into the storm. She pressed a hand to her chest long after the door shut, her breath unsteady. The town's whispers became blades. "She feeds him like a wife," Silas jeered at the saloon. "White hair tangled with red blood soon enough." Laughter followed, cruel and easy. Aurora felt their stares even when she walked alone. Yet strangely, shame no longer hollowed her as before. Beneath it stirred a fragile dignity, as if the weight of another's regard gave her strength she had forgotten. On a morning when frost jeweled every rail and branch, Aurora woke to a sound like soft thunder. She pushed open her door to find him there. Dakota, standing shirtless in the snow, arms folded, gaze fixed not on her but on the horizon. Snow clung to his dark hair, melted against his skin. He looked less a man than some figure carved out of the storm, unmovable, eternal. Her breath caught, her shawl slipping from her shoulder. For a long moment, neither moved. The street was empty, the world muted beneath snowfall. She felt exposed, seen in a way that frightened and steadied her at once. She could not name what trembled in her chest, only that it was dangerous and alive. She closed the door softly, leaning against it as her heart raced. In that silence, she understood something had changed. He was no longer just a shadow in the corner, or a hand leaving wood at her step. He was a presence that would not leave, a force tethered to her life whether she welcomed it or not. And as the storm thickened outside, Aurora knew that whatever lay ahead, the town's judgment was no longer her only battle. Something far more powerful had begun to stir. Aurora carried her silence like a veil, but memory was never silent. At night, when the fire dwindled to embers and the storm clawed at the shutters, her past returned in pieces sharp as glass. She remembered the husband who once placed lilies in her hands, a man steady in his kindness but frail in health. He died one spring before she turned 30, and the earth took him without mercy. Their children followed, 2 little graves beside his, fever stealing them in the same cruel season. Grief whitened her hair in weeks, as though time itself had punished her. The towns she drifted through afterward offered no comfort. Everywhere, whispers of curses followed her, until she came to expect rejection as the only greeting. By day, she stitched herself together through work. The miners' meals, the boarding house chores, the endless chopping and scrubbing. Each act kept her hands moving so her heart would not. But gossip had a way of creeping into the cracks. Clara Mayfield, the farm girl with shy eyes and braids down her back, lingered by Aurora's side one morning as she kneaded bread. "You make it softer than my ma," Clara whispered, cheeks flushed with admiration. Aurora's lips bent faintly, not quite a smile but something close. For a moment, she felt less ghost, more teacher. Yet the warmth of that moment quickly chilled when Clara's mother dragged her away, scolding her for keeping company with a cursed widow. Aurora returned to her dough with lowered eyes, hands trembling. The town grew restless with her presence. Silas Boone, whose voice was as coarse as the tobacco he chewed, made his disdain plain in the square. "Which widow?" he sneered, loud enough for every ear. "Hair like frost, heart like rot. No wonder even death clings to her." His companions laughed, their breath clouding in the winter air. Aurora kept walking, chin low, though each word pressed against her ribs like a blade. From the corner of the crowd, Dakota stood half-shadowed, his face unreadable. His dark eyes followed her, and for a moment she felt as though his steadiness anchored her against the jeers. He did not move, did not strike, though his hands curled once at his sides, then stilled. His silence was more potent than their noise. She wished she could borrow that calm, hold herself as unshaken as stone in storm. Instead, shame rose hot against her skin, leaving her breath shallow. Miriam Harker fanned the flames with relish. At the inn, she leaned across the counter and whispered to any ear willing to bend. "Rain follows her. Men vanish where she lingers. If you ask me, she carries bad fortune like a second shawl." Her words spread, slipping into markets, saloons, and homes. Before long, Aurora could feel eyes measuring her every step, waiting for her to confirm their suspicion. Loneliness pressed heavier, yet still she endured, because what else could she do? She had survived worse than whispers. One evening, after a long day that left her hands raw, Aurora returned to her cabin to find Dakota waiting by the hearth. The fire glowed steady, though she had left it near dying that morning. He sat on the floor with quiet ease, as though he belonged to the room without asking. She paused in the doorway, the cold pressing at her back. He lifted his gaze, met hers, and without a word gestured to the food on the table. She moved carefully, almost afraid to break the fragile stillness. She ladled stew into bowls, set one before him, and sat opposite. They ate without sound save the crackle of fire, and the faint storm scratching at the windows. The silence was not empty. It brimmed with unspoken things, her grief, his watchfulness, the world's disdain balanced between them. When she risked a glance, she found his eyes fixed on her, not with hunger, not with scorn, but with something quieter, steadier. She lowered her gaze, yet the warmth of his regard lingered like embers beneath her skin. Days passed, and each small act deepened the thread binding them. He repaired a roof beam split by frost. He left venison near her door when provisions ran thin. She, in turn, began leaving a second plate on the table, unspoken invitation waiting. Their bond grew not through words but gestures, quiet offerings that told more than speech could. Yet the town saw only what it wished to see. At market, Clara again approached, this time braver. "They're wrong about you," she said, clutching a basket of carrots. Aurora's heart softened, but before she could reply, Silas's voice cut sharp across the stalls. "Stay clear of her, girl. That savage's shadow stretches long. You'll find no blessing near her, only ruin." His words hung heavy. The townsfolk nodded, some crossing themselves, others turning away. Aurora froze, shame clawing at her throat. Clara's mother seized her arm and dragged her off, shooting Aurora a look of scorn. The girl glanced back once, her eyes full of sorrow. Aurora turned from the market, heart aching, steps unsteady. That evening, she found Dakota already inside, the fire burning bright. She stood in the doorway, unable to speak, until he rose and crossed the space between them. His hand lifted, rough fingers brushing a lock of her white hair back from her cheek. The gesture was neither possessive nor tender, but something steadier, as though to remind her the mark of her grief was not a curse but a truth. Her breath caught. For a moment she wanted to believe him, though he had not spoken. The storm outside roared, rattling the shutters. She closed her eyes, standing very still, the touch of his hand lingering like warmth against her skin. Her heart pounded with fear, not of him, but of what the world would say if she allowed this bond to grow. She thought of Miriam's whispers, Silas's jeers, Clara's stolen glances of sympathy. And yet, in the quiet of that room, all those voices dimmed. When she opened her eyes, he was watching her with that same unshakable calm. He lowered his hand, but the space between them no longer felt wide. She turned toward the fire, pretending to busy herself with the stew, though her hands trembled. The storm outside rose higher, as though echoing the turmoil within her. And when the night deepened, Aurora knew that her silence could no longer shield her. The town's judgment was mounting like snow upon a roof, heavy and dangerous, and sooner or later it would break. She could already feel the weight pressing down. And standing there by the fire, hair white as the frost outside, she understood. The world had already chosen sides, and soon she would be forced to choose her own. Winter deepened until the world seemed carved from ice and silence. The snow no longer fell in gentle flakes but in blinding curtains, each gust sweeping across the town with a howl that rattled doors and bent lampposts low. Aurora moved through it each day with her shawl drawn tight, her breath rising in frail wisps, her steps purposeful though her heart quaked beneath the weight of eyes that followed. What had begun as whispers now sharpened into open threats. Men spat in the snow as she passed, and women turned their shoulders, clutching their children away from her, as though sorrow might leap like contagion. Yet through the storm of judgment, Dakota walked beside her more often now, silent, steady, and unafraid of being seen. The sheriff called her aside one morning, his hat dripping with frost, his eyes tired but stern. "Aurora," he said softly, "folk are restless. They want someone to blame for this winter, for their losses, for the shadow hanging over them. And they've fixed on you." His glance shifted toward Dakota, who stood a short distance away, unmoving as a carved figure. "Him too. If you don't take care, there'll be blood before long." Aurora lowered her gaze, words withering on her tongue. She wanted to protest, to ask how grief and silence could breed such hatred, but she had lived long enough to know that reason rarely softens suspicion. She only nodded, her breath trembling in the cold. Dakota walked her back without speaking. His presence at her side made the air feel less cruel, though she feared it painted her target brighter. She sensed the town's eyes, their judgment pressed against her spine. Yet when she risked a glance at him, she saw no doubt in his face. His calm unnerved her, as though he had chosen his place long before she realized she had one worth guarding. At the market, Clara slipped from her mother's grasp and darted toward Aurora, thrusting a small hand-woven ribbon into her palm. "For your hair," she whispered, eyes bright with defiance. Aurora's throat ached with gratitude, but before she could speak, Clara's mother wrenched the girl back, hissing curses toward Aurora. Murmurs rose among the crowd. Silas Boone, his voice sharp as the wind, called out, "See how she corrupts the young? Mark my words, she'll drag us all down with her." His words spread like fire in dry grass, and the crowd shifted closer, their mutters swelling. Aurora felt the sting of 100 eyes, and her knees threatened to buckle. But Dakota stepped forward, his towering frame parting the air. He said nothing, his gaze sweeping the crowd with quiet command. The murmurs faltered. Even Silas, blustering, found his voice taper into silence beneath the weight of that unflinching stare. That evening, Aurora wept quietly as she stirred stew over the fire. Shame clung to her still, but woven into it now was something stranger, the fragile thread of dignity. Dakota sat near the hearth, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The scrape of stone against steel was rhythmic, steady, almost soothing. She wanted to ask him why he stayed, what he saw in her worth guarding, but the words caught. Instead, she set a bowl before him. He accepted without nod or smile, and they ate in silence thick with unspoken things. The storm outside grew merciless. Roofs collapsed beneath snow, animals froze in their pens, and tempers snapped in the cold. The town gathered in the square one night, their lanterns glowing dim through the blizzard. Aurora was caught returning from the kitchen when she saw the circle form. Silas's voice rang clear, his words bitter with anger. "This widow and her savage bring ruin. Look at the storms since they came. Look at our dead stock, our sick children. You call it chance? I call it curse." The crowd roared with agreement, faces flushed red from cold and fury. Aurora trembled, clutching her shawl, unable to summon defense. Then Dakota stepped into the square. Snow clung to his skin, his bare chest shining in the lantern light. He moved with unhurried steps, until he stood before her, placing himself between her and the mob. His silence was absolute. He carried no weapon, made no threat. He only stood, shoulders squared, breath steady, as if daring the storm itself to break upon him. The crowd faltered, voices dwindling. Even in their rage, they recognized the weight of his stillness. Aurora's heart thudded against her ribs. For the first time in years, she felt something beyond shame. She felt the safety of being chosen, defended without condition. Her breath hitched, tears pricking her eyes, but she held her ground behind him, her hand clutching the ribbon Clara had given her. The sheriff pushed through, scattering the crowd with weary authority, but the memory of that moment rooted deep in her chest. Later, in the hush of her cabin, she whispered, voice trembling, "Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken to him without fear. His gaze met hers, unreadable as ever, but he inclined his head once, as if to say he had merely done what was already decided. She wanted to press him for more, to understand what bound him to her silence, but the storm rattled the walls, and her courage faltered. Days blurred together, each heavy with judgment yet lit by quiet gestures. Dakota carried water for her without being asked, walked beside her through the snow, and fixed what broke before she noticed. Their bond, unspoken, grew like fire hidden beneath ash. The town muttered, scorn sharpened, but she found herself less bowed by it. Each glance from him steadied her spine, as if he lent her strength by standing near. Then came the night when the storm reached its peak, tearing shingles from roofs and burying doorways in drifts taller than a man. Aurora struggled through the squall, shawl whipped from her shoulders, when she stumbled into the square once more. Silas and his men were waiting, lanterns blazing, fury twisting their faces. "This ends now," Silas spat. "We'll drive you both out, or bury you here." The snow stung her eyes, her breath ragged. Fear gripped her, sharp and merciless. And then he was there. Dakota stepped from the white fury like a figure risen from the earth, his chest bare, his eyes steady, snow melting against his skin. He placed himself before her again. But this time, he turned his head just enough that his voice reached her ear. In the storm's roar, his words came low, deep and final. "I picked you as my wife." The world seemed to still, the blizzard itself pausing at the weight of the declaration. Aurora's heart staggered, caught between terror and something she had not dared feel in years, hope. She trembled, unable to breathe, while the mob's lanterns flickered wildly in the storm. And in that moment, with judgment crashing like thunder around them, she understood that nothing would remain the same. The town did not rest after Dakota's words. His declaration struck like a hammer on iron, sending sparks into every corner. By dawn, gossip blazed hotter than the hearth struggling against the storm. Miriam hissed to anyone who would listen that Aurora had bewitched him, that her pale hair and silence had snared a man too wild to know better. Silas prowled the saloon, stirring men with drink and fury, swearing no settlement could endure while a widow and a savage flaunted their defiance in plain sight. Aurora felt the weight of their scorn in every glance, yet she also felt something she had not in years, a fragile thread of belonging. For in Dakota's whisper, she had heard not pity but choice. Still, fear gnawed her. She kept her head low, kneading dough until her knuckles ached, scrubbing pots until her skin cracked, but judgment seeped through walls like smoke. Each time she stepped outside, voices followed. "Cursed woman," "Savage's whore," "Stormbringer." She bore them with silence, but inside, her heart tightened with dread. She wondered whether his words had sealed not her redemption but her ruin. And yet, when night fell, he was there, sitting near her fire as though nothing in the world could move him. His presence steadied her even as it deepened her turmoil. It was Silas who lit the match. One bitter evening, lanterns flared in the snow as men gathered outside her cabin, their boots crunching like the drumbeat of war. Aurora froze when the first stone struck her wall, the thud reverberating through her chest. Voices rose in cruel chorus. "Drive them out! Burn the witch! Send the savage back to the hills!" Fear clawed her throat, but before she could move, Dakota stepped into the doorway. He carried no weapon. His bare chest gleamed with firelight, snow streaked across his shoulders, his eyes steady as stone. The mob wavered at the sight of him, yet Silas pushed forward, face twisted, lantern high. "You don't belong here. Both of you are poison. We'll cleanse this town tonight." His voice cracked with rage, but also with fear, as though the very stillness of the man before him unsettled what courage he claimed. Aurora's breath came shallow. She wanted to cry out, to plead for mercy, but Dakota lifted a hand, silencing her before a word escaped. His gaze swept the crowd, and though his lips barely moved, his presence thundered louder than shouts. The storm howled above, rattling the eaves, but his calm was unbroken, as if the world itself had slowed to meet his will. Then the sheriff forced his way through the mob, coat flapping, voice harsh. "Enough! You'll not turn this town into a gallows." He planted himself between Silas and the cabin, hand on his revolver. The crowd faltered, murmurs breaking apart like brittle ice. Yet the hatred in their eyes remained, restless and dangerous. Aurora clutched the edge of the doorframe, her heart quaking. She knew this night would not vanish with the sheriff's words. The storm inside men's hearts rarely yielded so easily. When at last the crowd dispersed, muttering oaths into the snow, Aurora sagged against the wall. The sheriff cast her a look heavy with warning. "This ain't done," he murmured. "Be ready for what comes." Then he was gone, his figure swallowed by darkness. She turned back to Dakota, who remained in the doorway, shoulders broad against the night, as though no threat could pierce the stillness he carried. For the first time, tears slid down her cheeks. She whispered, broken and trembling, "Why do you stay? Don't you see what they'll do?" He turned then, and in the fire's glow, she saw not pity but resolve. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt before her, taking her hand and pressing it against his chest. His heartbeat thudded beneath her palm, strong and unwavering. His voice came low, like thunder muffled by distance. "Because I choose." The words struck deeper than any blade. Her shame, her grief, her long years of exile, all trembled against that steady heartbeat. For so long, she had lived as though cursed, as though survival were all she could claim. Yet here was a man who saw her not as burden, but as choice. Her breath shuddered, her tears fell freely, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe she was more than her sorrow. Dawn broke bright, the storm stilled, the snow glittering sharp as glass. The town stirred, bruised from the night's fury, but unyielding in its judgment. Aurora stepped outside, her shawl falling loose around her shoulders, her white hair gleaming in the sun. Dakota stood beside her, towering and silent, his presence a shield stronger than iron. Together they walked through the square, each step slow, deliberate, unbroken. Whispers flared, gasps rose, but no hand reached for them. Clara, standing by the market stall, smiled faintly, her ribbon bright in her hair. Silas watched from the saloon's porch, his jaw tight, but his voice did not rise. Even Miriam, lips pursed, lowered her gaze when Dakota's eyes swept past. Aurora's shame did not vanish, but it no longer bowed her. She walked as though every breath was defiance, every step a quiet declaration that she was no ghost, no curse, but a woman chosen, seen, and unafraid. In the center of town, Dakota paused. Without hesitation, he bent and lifted her into his arms, his strength effortless, his gaze fixed forward. Snow swirled in the sunlight, framing them like a crown. Aurora let her head rest against his shoulder, her hair spilling free, no longer hidden. The town stared, silenced not by force but by the undeniable truth of what they witnessed. In that moment, Aurora felt her life turn. She was no longer the widow cursed by grief, no longer the woman scorned by whispers. She was a wife in the eyes of a man who needed no witness, no priest, no paper to seal the vow. And in the hush that followed, she understood that dignity was not granted by others, but claimed in the quiet strength of being seen. Later, as the snow melted into rivulets along the boardwalks and the sky stretched clear and endless, Aurora looked upon the town that had rejected her, and felt no bitterness. She had been judged, cast aside, and nearly broken. Yet in the stillness of one man's gaze, she had been restored. And to those who listened, the memory lingered. How a white-haired widow and a shirtless warrior walked together through a storm of scorn, and emerged unbowed. For love, when it comes without words, without bargain, is the fiercest shield of all. So remember this, you who carry shame upon your shoulders. Sometimes the world will brand you unworthy, and sometimes even you will believe it. But there may come a day when someone's silence steadies you, when their choice restores you. And then, like Aurora, you will see that storms cannot bury the soul that dares to rise.